George Patton never knew what failure meant, and that, in a way, was exactly the problem. By the autumn of 1944, his Third Army had swept through France with unstoppable momentum, moving so fast that his own supply lines were left scrambling far behind. The pace of the advance was so relentless that to the tank crews pushing forward with him, the war had stopped feeling like a fight at all. It felt more like a one-sided chase. Then he reached a wooded hill along the Moselle River, where a small, ancient fortification called Fort Driant sat waiting for him. And that's where the chase came to a dead stop. Against his bombers, his artillery, and the infantry he threw into its 30-foot-deep moats and underground concrete bunkers, the fort simply refused to fall. For weeks on end, it just coldly swallowed up his forces, giving nothing back but the dead and the broken. It was the first time in the entire war that this fastest advancing Allied commander had been forced to do something that went completely against his very nature. He was forced to stop. When you get down to it, what stopped Patton outside Metz wasn't some extraordinary enemy force. It was an outdated fortress from a forgotten era of warfare, a brutal winter that tilted everything in the defender's favor, and a decision made far up the chain of command to cut off the fuel his army desperately needed. The wall that stopped him taught him a lesson he never wanted to learn. The man who arrived at the gates of Metz in the late summer of 1944 was, if you judge him without bias, without question, the most dangerous commander the Western Allies could have put in the field, and he knew it himself. Throughout August, his Third Army hadn't moved like an army in a campaign so much as a natural force given a direction, sweeping through France with such unstoppable momentum that the maps back at headquarters could barely keep up with the brutal reality on the ground. Towns that staff officers had expected to take days fell within hours. The German forces that had broken and stumbled out of Normandy seemed, within just a few weeks, to have lost the ability to do anything but retreat. For the American soldiers riding on the decks of tanks through one liberated village after another, the war carried the strange, almost intoxicating energy that belongs to a pursuit, and the man at the front had every reason to start believing that nothing on this continent could stop him. Speed was his religion, and that summer, France had made him its prophet. Metz was where that sermon ended. The city sat on the eastern bank of the Moselle River, a place with nearly 2,000 years of fortress history behind it. Its geography seemed almost perfectly designed to defeat the kind of war that he had mastered. The river and its tributaries wrapped around it on three sides, turning every approach into a waterlogged maze that armor simply couldn't power through. The hills encircling the city had been hollowed out over generations into a ring of roughly 20 underground forts. These were connected by tunnels and sealed behind reinforced concrete gates that were set so cleverly into the earth they were invisible from ground level, nearly impossible to range, with direct fire and highly resistant to attack from the air. The strongest of these works guarded the southern approaches. They'd first been built back in the 1870s during the Franco-Prussian War, improved during the First World War, strengthened again when the French extended the logic of the Maginot Line, and reinforced one final time by the Germans who now held them. In short, it was everything that Patton's way of war was not. It didn't move. You couldn't outflank it with speed. It simply waited, coiled, and ready. Patton loved to tell the story of Metz afterward, and that story deserves a closer look because it reveals as much about how victors write their own legends as it does about the battle itself. He'd claim, with obvious pride, that in taking the city he had accomplished something no commander had managed since Attila the Hun sacked it in the 5th century, that he was the first man in roughly 1,500 years to capture the great fortress of Metz. It's a magnificent boast, and it's been repeated ever since as a tribute to him. But what does the record actually show? Attila did sack the city in the year 451, though even that date gets garbled in later retellings. As for the claim that Metz had gone unconquered through all the centuries in between, history offers only the kind of clean, satisfying fact that doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Over those long centuries, the city changed hands more than once. It was taken by the French in the 1550s. It surrendered after a siege during the Franco-Prussian War. The less tidy truth is that Metz had indeed gone a very long time without being taken by direct assault, and that really is a genuine and remarkable achievement. But that's simply not the same thing as never having fallen. We're entitled to a degree of skepticism here, and it isn't only about getting medieval chronology right. There's a pattern in the way great commanders tell the stories of their victories. They instinctively reach for the grandest possible frame, wrapping a hard-fought and deeply contested achievement in the language of the unprecedented and the eternal. Patton had an extraordinarily deep knowledge of military history, and when he summoned the ghost of Attila to stand beside him, he knew exactly what he was doing. That reaching for a grand frame is itself a kind of evidence not of dishonesty, but of the fact that even the greatest soldiers feel an intense need for their suffering to mean something singular. The fortress waiting for him above the Moselle would put that need to its ultimate test. In the end, what stopped Patton at the gates of Metz wasn't the fortress itself, it was a long line of empty fuel tanks. To understand why the fastest-moving army in Europe came to a dead halt on the banks of the Moselle, you can't just look at German defenses. You have to look at the decisions being made far behind the front lines in the Allied High Command. The Supreme Allied Commander was caught between a shrinking supply of fuel and ammunition and far too many generals, all competing for the same resources. In the early autumn of 1944, the top Allied leadership chose to pour whatever was available northward into a bold airborne gamble in Holland, rather than eastward, into Patton's drive toward the German border. The trucks that had been hauling gasoline for the Third Army were reassigned. The flow of fuel slowed to a trickle, and on some days it stopped completely. For Patton and his men, this was an almost physical kind of agony. His whole way of war was built on momentum, on never giving a broken enemy the chance to catch its breath. And now, at the very moment when the enemy in front of him was at its most confused and most vulnerable, the war was put on pause. The official name for the order governing this period was aggressive defense, a phrase that, for someone of Patton's temperament, read like a contradiction in terms. It kept his army more or less in place from late September through the first week of November. He raged privately, and he couldn't help pushing right up to the edge of the order in practice. But one central fact was impossible to argue away. An army that can't be supplied with fuel can't move, and when the tanks run dry, all the tactical genius in the world counts for nothing. This pause wasn't something he caused, and he had no choice but to watch his forces sit still. What made this lull the true turning point of the entire campaign was what the Germans did with the breathing room they'd been handed for free. Every day the Third Army spent standing still on the Moselle was a gift to defenders who, just weeks earlier, had been on the verge of collapse. The German command used those weeks with cold efficiency. They scraped together the scattered survivors fleeing out of France, reorganized them into coherent fighting units, and fed them into the ready-made defenses at Metz, giving those ancient fortifications a proper, full-strength garrison for the first time in their history. In early September, the position could have been taken at minimal cost against a thin and shaken defense. By early October, it had become a well-manned, fully prepared strongpoint. The wall that would cost Patton so dearly was one the Germans built during the idle weeks American offensive operations had handed them. There was a second force at work during these same weeks, one colder and more absolute than any fuel shortage, and it goes a long way toward explaining why the fighting that followed would be so brutal. The dictator running Germany had issued a standing order for fortresses of this kind, and its logic left no room for flexibility. A fortress commander was required to hold at all costs, to allow himself to be surrounded if necessary, and to surrender only with the personal approval of the Führer, himself approval that, as a matter of deliberate policy, was almost never given. The soldiers dug into the Metz fortifications then weren't defending a position in any ordinary military sense. They had been ordered to fight until they were physically incapable of resistance, and they would do exactly that without wavering. It's worth stepping back at this point to look at what was really driving events, because it complicates the comfortable story that Patton was stopped simply by his own overconfidence. The force that stopped him first wasn't the German army, it was a choice made on his own side about where to send scarce resources, a choice that had nothing to do with Metz and everything to do with priorities 400 miles to the north. We tend to think of great battles as being decided by the men who fight them, by courage on the ground, by tactical skill, by the clash of wills between soldiers. More often than not, battles are decided before a single shot is fired, in rooms those soldiers will never see, by questions that are thoroughly unglamorous, like exactly how many gallons of fuel can be spared for one general's ambitions. The hand that truly stopped Patton at Metz didn't belong to any German. It belonged to the logistical reality of an alliance that had to keep redistributing resources it didn't have enough of. The restrictions were finally lifted, and Patton was free to push forward with full force. But the problem now facing his soldiers wasn't whether they had permission, it was the brutal, demoralizing weight of physical reality. The key to the entire southern approach to Metz was a single, isolated fortification, sitting atop a lush, wooded rise on the western bank of the Moselle River. It had been identified early on as the one bolt that had to be pulled before any door could swing open. The fort was designed with a cold, calculated ingenuity, as if it had been built for the sole purpose of consuming infantry. On its landward side ran a dry moat roughly 30 feet deep, a sheer man-made canyon that no soldier could cross on foot under fire, and no vehicle could easily bridge. Beyond the moat lay layers of barbed wire and interlocking fields of fire from machine guns housed in reinforced concrete bunkers. And behind all of that, buried under thick layers of earth and stone, were artillery positions and troop shelters capable of shrugging off anything short of the heaviest and most precise bombardment. Worst of all were the underground passages. Beneath the fort, a honeycomb of corridors ran in every direction, allowing the garrison to vanish from one threatened point and reappear unharmed at another, sometimes behind attackers who thought they'd already cleared the surface. It was a position with no obvious solution, a puzzle whose designer had, decades earlier, anticipated and sealed off every answer. The plan drawn up to crack it was given an optimistic codename and rested on even more optimistic assumptions. It called for the full weight of modern firepower to be brought down on the fort in sequence. First fighter bombers, then a devastating artillery preparation, then armor and infantry pushing forward together under covering fire, with aircraft standing by to take out any pockets of resistance that held on. On paper, it looked like a reassuring formula, a step-by-step tutorial for reducing a hardened target. But the assumption buried underneath it was nothing more than hope dressed up as scientific calculation. One infantry commander who was about to lead the assault declared that just a few regiments could take the fort by storm, that concentrated, violent firepower applied fast enough would crack it open before the defenders could react. It sounded like confidence. In practice, it turned out to be a catastrophic underestimate of what concrete and underground tunnels could absorb. Beneath the surface of tactical reasoning, there was a less noble motive at work, and it needs to be named because it fed the urgency that drove what followed. The corps commander pushing this assault wasn't operating in a vacuum of pure military logic. To his south, another corps in the Third Army was earning attention and praise for its successes around Nancy. That naturally stirred a very human, unspoken pressure. The unwillingness to be overshadowed, the reluctance to watch a neighboring force claim all the credit for breaking the stalemate, while your own troops sat idle in front of an intact wall. It would be unfair to blame the decision entirely on vain rivalry. Serious soldiers believed, on genuine grounds, that the fort had to be taken. But the eagerness with which they embraced the attack, the ease with which they accepted optimistic estimates and brushed aside cautious warnings, owed a great deal to that quiet competitive pressure that runs through every army and that military history tends to underreport. The men who were about to be sent against 30 feet of nothing and reinforced concrete were going there partly out of calculation and partly out of feeling. The fort, of course, was indifferent to all of it. It didn't know and didn't care which corps commander was hungry for recognition, which colonel had promised it could be taken by storm, or how elegant the assault plan looked on a headquarters map. It had its moat, its wire, its underground guns, and its tunnels. Whatever the attackers intended, those features would answer courage and firepower with the same cold, mechanical resistance they always had. There's a particular cruelty in placing human determination in front of a structure that was specifically engineered to destroy that determination, an asymmetry of strength that no amount of brave soldiers could simply cancel out. The men who went at that wall in the final days of September were as courageous as anyone in that war. They were about to learn that courage wasn't the variable that decided the outcome. The assault began in the early afternoon of September the 27th, and for one brief moment, it carried with it all the confidence that had gone into planning it. Just after 2 in the afternoon, fighter bombers swept low over the wooded high ground. Those blunt-nosed aircraft that had ruled the skies throughout the retreat across France, dropping 1,000-pound bombs and canisters of napalm across the face of the fortification. For the infantry waiting at the tree line, those few minutes looked like they might be enough. A strike of that magnitude, it seemed, was more than any garrison buried deep underground could survive. As the planes climbed away and the smoke began to drift, the soldiers rose and pushed toward the high walls. 2 infantry companies and a handful of tank destroyers advancing on the ditches and the wire. What happened next set the tone for everything that followed. The bombs had not reached the garrison sheltering in the deep bunkers. The concrete had held. The American soldiers found themselves exposed in the open, and the fort intact beneath its scorched outer skin opened fire. The advancing columns were torn apart within the first few minutes. The tank destroyers, designed to knock out other vehicles in open country, found themselves useless against gun positions sunk into the earth, out of reach and out of sight. A reserve company was committed to the attack and met the same fate. By the end of that first day, the only thing that had been clearly established was that the optimistic assessment had been badly wrong, and that the cost of discovering this had been severe. Over the next 10 days, the fighting became a slow and brutal education, measured in a rising count of the dead. The attackers paid an enormous price to gain even a foothold on the surface of the fortification, clinging to shell craters directly above the defenders' shelters, and it was there that they came to understand the full power of the tunnel system beneath their feet. Ground taken at great cost couldn't be held. German soldiers would vanish into the underground passages and reappear behind American lines or in the middle of their positions, cutting off assault teams and turning every inch of won ground back into contested territory within hours. Engineers crawled forward to seal tunnel entrances and blow firing ports, but the garrison would sortie from hidden exits to undo the work, so that the demolition effort itself became a kind of guerrilla war fought in smoke and darkness. There was no front line in any normal sense, only a torn and dangerous surface, beneath which the enemy moved freely, invisible, and untouchable. If there was a turning point, it came at dawn on October the 5th, and it came from a direction the attackers were entirely powerless to address. The fort, under assault, did not stand alone. It was one link in a mutually supporting ring of fortifications. That morning, a neighboring fort turned its guns on the contested high ground and fired directly into it, with no concern for the fact that friendly forces still occupied portions of the underground area. The American soldiers exposed on the surface had nowhere to shelter. Shells poured down on their own positions from a fort they had no way of reaching, and the casualties climbed at a terrible rate, enough to shatter an entire company within hours. It was in these circumstances that an officer at the deepest point of the penetration sent back a message that captured the whole grim episode, a situation report carried out by Runner because every other means of communication had been cut. He reported that the situation was critical. His men were used up, his equipment was wrecked, and in his own plain words, the enemy's artillery was slaughtering what was left of his force. He didn't think they could hold. By that afternoon, 2 assault companies had been reduced from full strength to fewer than 100 men. Reinforcements were found and committed. A new task force assembled from another regiment launched a fresh assault 2 days later. The logic of sunk costs is as powerful in war as anywhere else, and no one was yet willing to admit that the mission simply could not be done. But the renewed attacks changed nothing fundamental. The fort was still the fort. The ditches were still 30 feet deep. The tunnels still ran beneath the attackers' feet. the neighboring guns still covered the surface. The orders from the Führer still bound the garrison in place, with no possibility of surrender. The new men climbed the same high ground, paid the same price, and relearned the same lessons that their predecessors had already bought with their lives. The same arithmetic was simply worked through again with a new set of names. Looking back at this episode, it's important to resist the easy reach for words like slaughterhouse, not out of any squeamishness about what happened, but in the interest of accuracy. The true horror of Fort Driant was not at its core about blood and bodies. It was a mechanical horror. Brave and capable soldiers, thrown again and again at a structure of steel and concrete built for the sole purpose of outlasting them. A structure without feeling, without the capacity for negotiation, capable only of delivering the response its designers had built into it. The suffering on that high ground was the suffering of human flesh and will running up against something immovable and discovering, at slow and terrible cost, that the thing truly would not move. Every assumption that had driven the assault, the belief that air power could destroy the bunkers, the confidence that a few regiments could take the position by storm, the unspoken desire to match the victories being won elsewhere shattered against the patient and indifferent geometry of that place. The soldiers had done everything the orders asked of them. The soldiers could only accept defeat by spending their lives. The fort had done nothing, and the fort was winning. By the 9th of October, the question hanging over those lush, forested heights had shifted. It was no longer about how to take the fortress, it was about finding the courage to say out loud that the fortress could not be taken. This was one of the hardest moments any battle can produce, and in some ways, it was harder than launching the attack in the first place, because it ran against every instinct that keeps an army fighting. Armies are built to advance. Commanders are selected for their aggression. The whole machinery of military honor rewards persistence in the face of difficulty. To stop, to pull back, to admit that men had died for ground that would not be held, that demands a commander act against his own character and against the institutional foundations he was raised in, and to quietly swallow the bitter understanding that everything already paid for had bought nothing worth keeping. For a man like Patton, whose entire reputation and sense of self rested on the refusal to stop, this was just about the hardest order he could give. In the end, he didn't go up to the heights himself to give it. He sent his chief of staff to attend the meeting where the decision would be made, and that delegation was itself a kind of admission that this commander could not, or would not, stand on that ground and speak those words himself. With Patton's agreement, the verdict reached was to abandon the assault. The men were spent, ground down past the point of combat effectiveness by an experience that had consumed them and produced nothing. And elsewhere around the city, other operations were showing more promise, enough to justify shifting resources that had been poured into the heights for no return. There was no way to soften what this meant. The assault on the fortress had failed, and the withdrawal now being ordered would make that failure official, and Patton would have to own it. The retreat turned out to cost nearly as much in spirit as the attack had cost in blood. Over the days that followed, the surviving units pulled back from the fortress walls they'd been clinging to, and as they came down, they destroyed everything they couldn't carry. Unwilling to leave anything to the enemy that had been bought at such a price, tanks that couldn't be recovered were blown in place. Engineers brought in thousands of pounds of explosives and used them to collapse the bunkers, shelters, and tunnel entrances around the fortress barracks. A final, furious reply to a structure that had defeated every effort thrown against it. Then, on the 13th of October, the last of the attackers came down from the heights, and the fortress, blackened, cratered, scarred, but fundamentally unshaken, remained in German hands. By any honest measure, it was an American defeat and a German success, and it would rightly go down in history as the one clear battle Patton lost. It's easy to look at this withdrawal and see only failure, but that reading misses something essential about what command actually requires. When courage means charging forward, being courageous is the easier part. The harder and rarer kind of courage is the kind that can recognize when pressing on has become pure waste and give the order to stop even knowing what that admission will cost. Patton's legacy as a believer in the attack as a man who held that boldness solves most problems and that the cautious are usually wrong, holds a great deal of truth. But the decision to let go of Fort Driant belongs to a different and less celebrated kind of command, one that knows when something cannot be done and refuses to keep sending men to their deaths just to avoid admitting defeat. He took no pride in it, and he buried it as quickly as he could beneath louder victories. For a commander shaped entirely around the absolute imperative to advance, the willingness to stop may have required a harder act of will than any order to charge he ever gave. It is the part of this story he least wanted remembered, and for exactly that reason, it is the part most worth remembering. The failure at the forts didn't end the fight for Metz, it only changed how the fight would be waged. When the Third Army received adequate supplies in the first week of November and launched its full offensive, Patton stepped back from the idea of tearing through the fortress belt by hammering its strongest points head-on. Instead, he turned to an older, slower, and far more deliberate logic: encirclement. If the forts couldn't be taken by storm, then the city they guarded would be surrounded, the garrison's escape routes and reinforcement lines cut, and each strongpoint reduced at whatever pace reality demanded. It was, in essence, a siege, a strategy built around starving and strangling the Germans inside their own defenses. This was a complete departure from everything that had made his reputation, the lightning strike traded for the patient noose. And it was exactly the right call, because it acknowledged what a month of costly failure had already proven: some problems cannot be solved with speed. This particular problem could only be ground down through relentless, unsentimental, unrelenting pressure. The environment in which that pressure had to be applied was among the most miserable of the entire Western campaign. Late autumn turned cold and wet. The ground dissolved into the heavy, clinging mud of Lorraine. The rivers ran high, and the sky was almost permanently overcast, conditions that frequently grounded aircraft and left the infantry to carry the burden of the assault on their own. Soldiers crossed the Moselle and its tributaries under fire in assault boats, clawed out bridgeheads on the far bank, and began closing the encirclement around the city from both north and south. Almost none of this resembled the war of movement they had grown used to. It was a regression to an older and harder form of warfare, a soldier's war, saturated with cold, mud, and deep exhaustion, where every yard had to be fought for against an enemy who had been ordered to hold and had nowhere to go, even if he'd wanted to leave. Inside the city, the fighting took on the particular ugliness that urban combat always produces. Ground was measured not in miles but in buildings, and the advantages of the defender multiplied at every turn. German soldiers burrowed into basements of shops and homes, turning each structure into its own small fortress that had to be reduced independently. There was no sweeping through with unstoppable momentum here. Squads of infantry picked their way through rubble-strewn streets, clearing buildings one by one with grenades and small arms. Tanks followed close behind, delivering direct fire at point-blank range against fortified positions that couldn't be broken any other way, blasting defenders out floor by floor and room by room. It was slow, dangerous, and grinding work, the kind that earns no newspaper headlines, produces no dramatic breakthroughs, and leaves nothing behind but the slow and costly accumulation of cleared blocks and the lives spent clearing them. 2 infantry divisions carried most of the weight, and one of them fought its way through the suburbs in brutal house-to-house combat and earned the name that would follow it forever: the Iron Men of Metz. That title was paid for in the hardest currency there is. The defenders made them pay for every yard, though not out of any hope of victory. By November, it was obvious to any clear-eyed man inside the city that there was no realistic prospect of holding out indefinitely, and the defenders knew it. They fought because they had been ordered to. A standing decree forbade any fortress from surrendering without explicit authorization, and the only escape route eastward was being watched by their own security police, stationed there specifically to ensure that no one chose to use it. There was a particular kind of horror in that arrangement, one that had nothing to do with the violence of the battlefield. It was the horror of being nailed in place, driven not by hope or duty, but by the clear-eyed knowledge that retreat meant a different kind of death waiting just behind them. They held their basements and their forts because the alternative had been made unthinkable, and the Americans had no choice but to dig them out of positions they were forbidden to leave. By mid-November, the ring had closed. The last escape corridor was cut completely, the city was fully isolated, and what remained was the slow strangulation of those still holding out. Even then, the end wasn't clean. The city itself was declared secured on the 22nd, and the Corps commander formally returned it to French civilian authority, but several of the outer forts, bound by the same unbreakable order, refused to yield even after being isolated and surrounded, and fought on for weeks more as irrelevant pockets of resistance long after the outcome had been decided. The fall of Metz was not a single climactic event. It was a prolonged process of attrition, measured in cold days, cleared city blocks, and surrendered strongpoints, entirely lacking the dramatic shape that the public imagination expects a victory to have. It's worth dwelling on how unglamorous all of this was, because the contrast with the legend is genuinely instructive. We remember Patton for his speed, his audacious strokes, his flair for the theatrical, and the capture of Metz fits none of that. What actually conquered the city was not a flash of brilliance. It was the least glamorous set of qualities an army can possess: patience, endurance, and the willingness to do the cold and dangerous work, and keep doing it. The decisive variable was never courage, and it was never cleverness. It was simply a raw, crushing capacity to absorb punishment and keep moving forward. The greatest practitioner of mobile warfare in the United States Army ultimately took Metz by setting aside the very qualities that made him great and accepting the patient arithmetic of the siege. The city fell not because of individual genius, but because of the stubbornness of soldiers. And that's not a stirring story, but it is a brutally honest one. On the 22nd of November, the city of Metz was officially declared pacified. The Corps commander who had led that long and grinding assault formally returned it to French civilian authorities in a ceremony. And the inscription left behind that day still stands, marking the moment the fortress passed out of German hands. The fortresses themselves died more slowly. Isolated, encircled, cut off from any hope of relief, they fought on, in obedience to orders they couldn't refuse. It wasn't until early December that the great fortification on the heights above the Moselle, the one that had shattered the September assault and handed Patton his one unambiguous defeat, finally surrendered. The last holdout was a fort on the eastern bank, which didn't give up until mid-month. That moment was the real victory, the true end of the Battle of Metz. It had taken the better part of 3 months and had cost far more than the clean word victory could ever convey. In the whole long and punishing affair, the moment most worth holding onto as its defining image wasn't a moment of triumph at all, and it didn't happen on the battlefield. It happened in a hospital, far from cameras and ceremony, and it showed a version of Patton that was more complicated and more admirable than the swaggering figure from the legend. Moving through the wards, he stopped beside a wounded soldier and asked if the man had heard that Metz had fallen. The soldier smiled and said he had. Then Patton, who understood better than anyone how the headlines would read, took the man's hand and told him the truth that those headlines would bury. He said the papers tomorrow would carry the line, "Patton takes Metz," and he told that wounded soldier straight out that it was a flat-out lie. It was that soldier and his comrades who had taken Metz. The general's name would get the glory. The men lying in those beds had paid the price. For someone as intensely vain as Patton, that was a remarkable thing to say, honest enough to crack the entire mythology built around him, including the parts he'd built himself. This was the same commander who had boasted of standing in the same line as Attila the Hun, who had hungrily sought out the grandest possible frames for his own accomplishments. Yet in that unguarded moment, beside the wounded, he set all of that aside and spoke the plain truth about how the victory had actually been won, and by whom. That contradiction was the man. He desperately wanted to be a figure of history, and at the same time he knew, with clear-eyed honesty, whose blood had paid for the history he wanted to be part of. Both things existed in him at once. And what he said in that hospital was the moment the second truth broke through the first. Patton wasn't a legend. Patton was also flesh and blood. Beyond the hospital scene, there's one final irony, and it belongs to the other side of the wire. The German garrison of Metz was proud of what they'd done during those autumn weeks, and not without reason. They had stopped a seemingly unstoppable army in its tracks and bought their high command precious time. They were proud enough that approval was eventually given to establish a special decoration to commemorate the defense, a cuffband worn by those who had fought there. What it honored wasn't the dramatic fall of the city in November. It commemorated the earlier weeks, the fighting of late summer, when a hastily assembled battle group, stiffened by officer cadets from the local military academy, had first turned the Americans away during the long pause. In other words, what the Germans chose to remember wasn't their eventual defeat. It was the moment they had stopped Patton cold, those weeks when the walls had held. Their proudest memory of Metz was precisely the period of his greatest frustration, the weeks when the fastest-moving commander in the Allied forces couldn't move at all. Placed side by side, those two acts of remembrance reveal the peculiar character of the whole campaign with unusual clarity. On the American side, the victor himself insisted, in a hospital ward, that the victory wasn't his. On the German side, the defeated army struck a medal and chose to remember not their fall, but the peak moment when they had blunted his edge. Both sides were, in their own way, cutting through the official story toward something truer. Whatever the headlines said, the men lying in those beds had taken Metz. The men who wore that cuffband had, during those hard weeks, genuinely beaten George Patton and his army, whatever the final outcome of the battle. A fortress that had stood on the banks of the Moselle for 1,500 years had its own way of stripping the legend from the men who fought over it, and leaving behind only the harder facts of the ground. When the final tally was put into numbers, it carried a weight that no headline ever had. The fortress perched on the high ground above the Moselle River, the one that had handed Patton clear and undeniable defeats in September and October, cost the American forces nearly 800 casualties for ground that was later abandoned, and it fell only on the enemy's own timeline. The broader campaign to take the city consumed more than 7,000 soldiers of the Third Army. The entire long Lorraine campaign centered on Metz, those months of mud, rivers, and fortified towns that filled the stretch between the dash across France and the turn toward the German border, cost the Third Army more than 55,000 casualties, with more than 6,000 of them never coming home. These are not the numbers of a lightning triumph. They are the numbers of a long, grinding, and costly struggle, the kind that tends to get left entirely outside the legend of the fast-moving armor commander. That omission is worth sitting with, because it cuts right to the heart of how we remember figures like Patton and the war itself. The story that survived is a story of speed and audacity, the dash across France, the bold relief of a besieged town, and Metz fits so awkwardly into that story that it has largely been allowed to drop out. The fortresses that stopped him, the objectives he couldn't crack, the months spent gaining nothing on waterlogged high ground, and the patient and unglamorous siege that finally finished the job, none of it fits the image of the unstoppable conqueror, and it has quietly faded from public memory, while the more dazzling episodes keep catching the light. We held on to the legend and let go of the parts that were genuinely complicated and hard. And it's exactly those complicated, hard parts that tell the truth. Patton himself said as much, directly, right there in that hospital ward. The names that fill the history books are not the names that paid the bill. The headline said Patton took Metz, and he said in plain language that the headline was a lie, not because he did nothing, but because the achievement belonged to tens of thousands of names that would never see print. The fortresses above the Moselle were indifferent to reputation and immune to boldness, and they forced one of the greatest showmen the war produced into a posture his legend simply cannot hold. The posture of a man who was stopped, who was frustrated, who had to abandon the attack and bury the memory, and who ground out a victory by the least glamorous means available. The true texture of the war was harder than any cavalry charge. The cost of the legend is that it cannot carry these things, it can only shed them. The cost of the truth is that it asks us to remember the soldiers on those hospital beds, to remember the high ground where they were spent, and to understand that this too was George Patton's war.